Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 27 of the Lebanese Biodiversity Podcast. My name is Mira, and I am an entomologist. Today is the third and last episode on the topic of wild bees for this year. My guest is Thomas Wood, a PhD in biology who found his way to entomology and now specializes in wild bees. His work focuses on taxonomy, biogeography, and ecology. He is currently a researcher at Naturalis in the Netherlands. When I met Tom, he was on his second postdoc in Belgium at the same lab where I was doing my PhD. Back then, he started working on the fauna of the region through museum collections, but also the bees I had brought back from Lebanon. And in 2023, he was able to join me for a field visit in Lebanon in which we mainly focused on the Bekaa region. After having worked on countless bees from Lebanon and the area, he will be telling us about his work on the bee fauna of the region, specifically Andrena, or mining bees, which are a group of solitary ground nesting bees. Tom has described several new species of Andrena from Lebanon and the region, and I will be linking some of his papers in the caption. So, join us to know more about Andrena, what we know about the bee fauna of the region, and a glimpse into the work of a taxonomist and ecologist. If you want to know more about wild bees in general, you can check out episode 25. Enjoy and see you in the next one. So, good evening, Tom. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Been looking forward to this interview podcast.
Yes, me too. So, can you start by telling us about yourself and your background?
So I come from England. I grew up in the south of England, between London and the south coast, and I was always interested in nature, but I didn't start entomology at a very young age. I just did a general biology degree. And it was not until my master's and PhD that I actually started working on insects. I completed my PhD in England, working on farmland bees and how we can manage their populations. And then I worked in the United States for 2 years in Michigan. And then I came back to Europe, to Belgium, where I worked at a university in Wallonia. And then for the last year, I have been in the Netherlands at the Naturalis Biodiversity Centre, which is my current job.
That's 4 countries or 5 countries. At some point, you just mentioned that you started working on bees or just insects in general during your master's degree. What was the turning point? Why did you decide to start studying wild bees?
Well, it's somewhat random. So I had become interested in trees and flowers and then butterflies and moths, but I hadn't really found my group. And then actually one of the students on the master's course gave a sort of mini workshop talking about bumblebees and sort of how to recognize them and how to identify them. And I'm lucky I was there that day, and I found them fascinating. And I started consuming all of the available literature, photographing bees, on the campus and in the woodland. And yeah, it all went from there. Some serendipitous chance.
Yes. Well, you already had the interest in nature and insects. It was just a matter of time before you found your group, as you say. But yeah, that's a happy coincidence, I would say. Before asking you a bit more about, the topic of today's interview, can you tell us more about like the nature of your work as a taxonomist, as an ecologist? What types of projects are you typically involved in?
Yeah, so I try and find a balance between being an ecologist, which is my background. I was doing uh, bee ecology and conservation. That's where I come from. And then balancing that against taxonomy. So more fundamental, how do we recognize species? Uh, what's the difference between two species? What are their ranges? And can we produce identification keys and describe new biodiversity? So I try and create a synthesis. At the moment at Naturalis, my position is a researcher, and one of the major projects I'm working on now is about taking that taxonomic knowledge and making it available to professionals and to the public. So the European Union is funding a project to monitor pollinators in every member state. And in order to do this, they need identification resources in Southern Europe, in the Mediterranean, as we will talk about later. Bee diversity is high and they are quite difficult to identify. So we're going to be providing training courses and new keys so that professionals and citizen scientists can monitor bee populations so we can look after them better.
Okay, this is actually the perfect link to the next question I wanted to ask you, which is how do you determine wild bees? For a lot of people who are interested in nature, one of their entry points is photography, right? So you take pictures of birds or of small mammals or flowers, and a lot of them are identifiable by picture. So is it the case for wild bees? And if not, what tools do you need to put a species name on something that you find?
So the simple answer is that most bees are not identifiable by photograph to a species level.
Okay.
If you were just to take any random bee in a random country. In countries with smaller fauna, such as in Northern or Northwestern Europe, where we have a good understanding, you can go quite far. You can take a lot of context clues. And obviously, there are just, well, not obviously, we can talk about why the diversity of bees is lower in the north and higher in the south. You can go quite far, but if you go to a country like Lebanon, the diversity of bees is so high, and our knowledge is still so incomplete that getting to a species level is very challenging. You can obviously recognize things like honeybees and some of the bumblebees, but for the
Yes.
more diverse groups, it's too difficult.
Okay, so any inventory work or any monitoring work has to go through sampling them or
Yes,
collecting them.
it's a little bit unfortunate that we don't have the same kind of fauna as butterflies, where there's such a good knowledge that people now rarely have to collect butterflies. You can do almost all of them, except for some of the very difficult groups, just by observing them or photographing them. So typically, a bee taxonomist will have a collection. This can be a personal collection or an institutional collection. For example, Naturalis, as the Natural History Museum of the Netherlands, has, I'm not sure exactly how many, but perhaps more than 1 million bee specimens from around the world. And someone who's trying to identify bees will have to look at them under a microscope, and using books and modern keys, you can identify them by following characters and a typical identification key.
Okay, but as you just said, in the near future, maybe we will be able in Lebanon to benefit from some of the tools that you develop for the Mediterranean in the course of this project and maybe other projects. So, well, this will not make the job a lot easier, but hopefully this will make bee knowledge or wild bee knowledge more accessible to people who would be interested in the group.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the most difficult faunas in Europe is the fauna of Greece, for which there are very few keys. But in the next 2 years, there will be keys to bees in Greece. And whilst Lebanon obviously has a Levantine fauna, there are still a lot of species in common with Greece. So this will be a good starting point for our knowledge of the East Mediterranean. If you understand Greece, then you understand not all, but a big part of the Eastern Mediterranean, at least for bees.
Yes, well, this is great. Looking forward to having more tools, and this will be a good starting point. This is much better than, well, the knowledge that we had maybe 10 years ago. Now, to start speaking about Lebanon. Before you were able to visit Lebanon, you were able to look at a lot of material so that I had collected, that other people had collected, that I had taken with me to Belgium, but also from museums and from the Levant in general. So, looking at all of these wild bee specimens without actually having been to a country, what can you tell about the fauna, the flora, and just, the landscape in general?
So it's I'd say it's been a pretty common story for me that I've mostly investigated bees and learned about them before ever visiting the place where they come from. And uh, as you gain experience, you can sort of paint a picture of the landscape. Um, because bees, like all insects, they tend to radiate. They tend to evolve, um, and they tend to closely related species tend to share the same ecological niche. So if you have one species that likes using the daisy family, Asteraceae, and you have a closely related species, there's a good chance that it will also like that type of plant. And so as you look at a country and you see the types of bees that are present, you can sort of think about the kind of flowers there might be or the kind of climate. Some bee lineages you find in mountains and some you find in deserts. And so if you start finding the mountain lineages, you can make assumptions. You can, of course, also just look at a map. But using the bees, they tell you a story about the kind of habitats that you would find.
Yes, well, thank you for answering this question. And this is very interesting, sorry, for me, because as you mentioned, you and a few people I have met in the last few years have had the opportunity to examine massive amounts of specimens coming from places that they do not know. Well, as your experience grows, this mental map that you have of the bees and their biogeography is also growing, and the information becomes easier to extrapolate. So you were finally able to visit Lebanon in 2023, I believe. It was in April.
Yes.
What are the areas that you were able to visit and collect bees in?
Well, after landing in Beirut, we were able to drive over the I can't remember the name of the pass, but one of the passes in the Mount Lebanon
Yes,
system and travel into the Bekaa Valley.
we crossed Dahr el Baidar.
Thank you. I won't even attempt to pronounce that.
It's fine.
And then we were able to stay in the southern part of the Bekaa Valley, and we were able to, I'm going to give terrible pronunciations. We were able to visit some of the villages surrounding that area and the southern edge of Lake Airun. Probably you need to say what they,
Araon. Yes,
yes,
but we only have one
exactly.
lake in the area, so don't worry. But the people will know what you're referring to.
We were also able, and so there it was almost, it wasn't quite steppe, but it was very open, flower-rich grassland on calcareous soils, which was extremely interesting. We were able to travel a little bit further north in the Bekaa Valley um, to the American University of Beirut farm, so working farm or experimental station, where we were able to see a more you start to see influences from Turkey, with some species found in southern Turkey that travel over more dry, open grassland habitats. We were also able to travel to the northern side of I would say, the mountain of the Sheikh, Jabal, how do you
Jabal
say it?
el-Sheikh.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Um, to about 1,500 meters. So almost approaching the snow line.
People who come from the Levant are extremely proud of being from the Levant. We always want to hear the impressions of people who visit Lebanon after they have visited. So, like, tell us, what was your impression?
My impression was that it's just a remarkable variation in habitats in an extremely small area. To drive from Beirut to the Bekaa Valley in 1 hour, and then from there to, in another hour, you could be in a semi-desert if we had crossed the anti-Lebanon. I forgot to say also that we went to Anjar, so we got a small taste of the edge of the anti-Lebanon chain.
Yes.
Um, when I was doing fieldwork in Morocco, one can go from sort of semi-desert to subalpine in an hour and a half. And I had that exact same impression in Lebanon. You could almost see everything within an hour or two.
Well, this is something that I did not appreciate fully before going abroad. It is something that I just took for granted. So having a landscape that changes this quickly and being able to see just so many different vegetation groups and trees changing with altitude in such a short time. So with perspective, I find this amazing as well. And we haven't mentioned your specialty group yet. So until now, we've been speaking more about your work, like in a broader sense. You specialize in Andrena. And can you tell us more about this wild bee family, maybe briefly on the ecology and what they look like?
Yeah, so Andrena, which in English are also called mining bees because they dig a hole in the ground to make a nest, which is not particularly special. Most bees dig a hole in the ground, but that is the name they were given. So it's a very large genus of bees, um, and they are found very commonly in the Northern Hemisphere. So if you go to North America, including, say, Mexico as well, so United States, Canada, Mexico, all of the Palearctic, so the Mediterranean, Central Asia, Eastern Asia, China, and Japan, that's where you mostly find them. Um, they don't like it too hot, so they really like Mediterranean or temperate habitats, and they fly. A lot of them fly in the spring. And so at the moment, there are about 1,700 species, which makes them enormously diverse. So when you go to Mediterranean or temperate countries in the spring, you will find many, many, many species flying at the same time, and they all live in the ground, but they will fly into the trees and herbs, and you can find them almost anywhere um, during the spring and the summer.
So when you go out and look for them, you partially answered this question, but they are almost everywhere. You just need to find a flowering patch in the spring or patch of bare soil where they could potentially be nesting. Are there any other things to keep in mind when you go out and look for Andrena?
Something that people often don't realize is you also have to look up. So possibly more than any other bee group, though I should probably do more research before saying that, but they use flowering trees. So if you go and you see a flowering willow or a flowering cherry tree or apple tree, you can often find great clouds of Andrena flying around the flowers. Um, so yes, look down, but also look up.
Okay, well, I think it's safe to say, at least in Lebanon, that they would be the most common visitors of flowering trees because few other bees would emerge that early. I could see bumblebee queens, sometimes a few xylocoppa, but really in abundance and in the diversity of species that would be visiting flowering trees, there will be a lot of Andrena. You just gave us an overview about their ecology, where people can look for them, which is basically everywhere. So you can open your door and do 2, 3 meters in your garden, and there would be some random flowering patch, and there would probably be Andrena over there. So what do Andrena look like? A lot of species can look like a generic bee. What I mean by this is that they can look quite similar to honeybees. A lot of species are brown or black with yellow or brown pilosity, and some species can have abdomens that are partly red, for example. The females have their pollen brushes covering the entire hind leg, so the entire back leg, and they have a characteristic curly patch of hair right at the underarm. Another characteristic of Andrena is what we call fovea, which we can see in both males and females. These are grooves or a sort of light depression on their face that run parallel to the eyes. This is the field part, so you go look for bees on the field, and there are hours and days and years of work that can follow this. Can you tell us a bit more about this? So, your work as a taxonomist, maybe starting by introducing what is taxonomy and how you manage that part of your work.
Yeah, so as I sort of hinted at earlier, taxonomy is really just trying to answer the question, what is a species and how do we recognize it? Now, the simple answer is that species don't really exist, and because there's never a really rock solid definition that works all the time, everywhere for every organism. But understanding species is a necessary construct so that we can study behavior, ecology, how species interact, how to look after species. So I view it as the job of a taxonomist to be able to say that that cow is different from that sheep, that these animals are different, and this is how you recognize them, and that definition can be shared with people, and people can agree, and then we can communicate. And in terms of doing that with bees, you have to spend a lot of time looking down a microscope to understand how different bees change in their size, their shape, their color, the shape of their hairs, and how their body looks. If the surface is lumpy or bumpy or punctured or crinkly or with sort of ridges, or if it's polished and smooth. So a lot of taxonomic papers, people will describe in enormous detail exactly whether something is, how bumpy it is, or how many punctures there are. So it tends to be very dense and technical, but a good taxonomist will be able to communicate that in a way that's understandable and produce something that can be understood by a wider audience so that they can go into the field and they can say, yes, this is BA and this is BB.
So, from what you told us, a lot of the work is based on morphology, so on what the species or on what the bee looks like. You do need a good microscope and also reference material for that. Are there other tools that can help you for species determination other than morphology?
Yes, so I would say that there are, in addition to morphology, there are three major pieces of evidence that I use. The first would be genetics. It's now very easy to generate genetic sequences from specimens. And by comparing the sequences, you can see if two individuals are close or if two individuals are strongly separated. And by collecting a lot of this data, or a lot of these data, you can have a probability and you can understand if a group is close or a group is widely separated. And these data can be integrated with morphology to give a more complete picture. The second evidence I use would be behavior. And so this could be, for example, the pollen that they collect. Many bees, including Andrena, are what are called specialists. So they will only visit one type of flower or one botanical family, like, for example, the daisy family, Asteraceae, and collect pollen only from that family. And so if you have two species or two types of bee, and you're not sure if they're the same or different, you can also gather data on what pollen they collect, and if they show different preferences, well, that suggests that they could be different species. So again, that can be integrated with your morphology and your genetics to make a more complete picture. And the third piece of evidence can be biogeography. So
Okay.
where species are distributed. So for example, you might have one form, something that looks like a species that is found in really humid Mediterranean habitats, for example, on the coast of Lebanon. And then maybe another sort of form, and maybe this is found in drier habitats, such as around Damascus or Sanilurfa in southern Turkey. And you might think, oh, okay, maybe they have recently split and one prefers humid habitats and one prefers dry habitats. And I would say by integrating all of this information, you can be more confident in recognizing different species.
Editing self here to paraphrase what Tom just said. So, we have four tools that can help us determine a species. The first one is morphology, what it looks like. The second is genetics. The third is its behavior. So, for example, what diet does it have? And the fourth is biogeography or its distribution. So, where does it like to live? It's always interesting when speaking to insect taxonomists to highlight that sometimes, even with these tools, it can be difficult to give a final answer and separate the species. So, in Lebanon, after having talked about this with you for hours, I do realize that for a lot of species, even with all the tools you have, the job is still very difficult.
Particularly in a country like Lebanon, because there are so many influences from the north, from the east. You're a sort of meeting point for many different species and species groups.
We have always been very proud of being at the meeting point of the three continents. This is translated in the fauna. So to start, like giving us an idea on the Andrena fauna of Lebanon, how many species are known currently?
So we haven't published this yet, but hopefully soon.
Yes.
But the current total that I have is 153, which, to offer the listeners some context, is not quite as high as in a huge country like France, which is about 180, but it's approaching, and maybe with a few more years of surveying, we will get up to 180. So it's truly remarkable to have such a huge diversity in such a small area.
So, you also had mentioned in some of your recent presentations and work that Lebanon has a very high number of species compared to its surface. Is this still the case?
Yes. So at 10,000 square kilometers, the ratio of species to square kilometer, uh, Lebanon is the most species dense in the world. You also get high density in countries like Cyprus, or in some Balkan countries like North Macedonia or Bulgaria. Um, but Lebanon is almost it's almost twice as high in terms of density, in part because there's such a diversity of habitats, which naturally results in a high diversity of bees using these different habitats.
One of the other factors that contributed to this, if I remember correctly, was the fact, well, you mentioned this a bit earlier, but that the East Mediterranean is one of the areas from which Andrena species radiated.
Yes, it's a good time to to work on Andrena because in the last couple of years there were two phylogenies published. So a phylogeny takes organisms and generates genetic data from many, many, many different genes. So you're sort of taking lots of independent pieces of evidence, and then it can basically calculate how similar or how different individual species are, and basically build a tree that uh, that shows us or suggests how the species or species group or family evolved. And when we do this for Andrena, we find that the sister group, so basically about 25 million years ago, Andrena appeared and they separated from their sister, so their most recent common ancestor. And the sister genus, called Cubiandrena, is found mostly in Turkey. And when you look at the really old groups of Andrena, they are also found in Turkey and the Levant. So this is very strong evidence that about 25 million years ago, Andrena appeared, either in the Levant or Turkey or both. We need a little bit more data to be more precise. But that's already quite precise when working at a global scale.
So you gave us the total of species that we have in Lebanon, so Andrena species that we have in Lebanon. How many new species were you able to describe from Lebanon in the recent years?
Starting in 2020, I've so far described 6 from Lebanon, but there's a few more coming. There'll be one coming later this year that I collected on Jabal al Sheikh. So yeah, that will be described later this year.
Since the time of recording this episode, the paper that Tom is referencing is already published now, and the species that he described from Mount Hermon is called Andrena mysteria, because it is mysterious and we still don't know which subgenus it belongs to. The Lebanese specimen was captured foraging on flowers of Acer or Ayab during the early bloom of these trees on Mount Hermon, and it was in April 2023. Okay, and from the species that you described, can you pick one of them and tell us about its ecology? So maybe the habitat where you found it, and if you have any idea about the flower preferences or what it prefers to eat.
Yes, I was very pleased to be able to describe a species called Andrena cedricola. So the suffix cola in scientific Latin means living in or from. So it means the Andrena that lives in the cedars. And this was unsurprisingly collected from the Mount Lebanon chain at high altitude from remnant cedar woodland.
Yes.
And I didn't collect it, but it was shown to me by you. So that was a very nice surprise to see this new species. And as is quite typical of a lot of Andrena that live in mountains, it's small and black, and it comes out when the snow melts. So in May or June, and it collects pollen from small brassicaceae flowers. So these are obviously small and they can grow quite quickly once the snow melts. So they provide kind of early by the standards of cedar forest pollen. And so this little species lives in the mountains, and it goes also into mountains in southern Turkey, southern and eastern Turkey. I imagine it also waits for the snow to melt and then it comes out.
Yes, well, I remembered the place I collected it in, which is near the Tenorin Reserve. This is a good example of you examining material and being able to work on material of places you did not visit. Also, very happy to see that new species could come out of this. Now, I know that the knowledge is still incomplete, but do you think we have enough information now to have a conservation status for Andrena. So if we were to, say, start a red list project, do you think we have enough information, at least for some of the species, to be able to say, well, they'll be fine or they're probably going extinct?
So assessing insects is always much, much harder than assessing vertebrates. That's just a fundamental problem because their population dynamics are just very different. Um, they are hard to quantify. Um, I'm always very jealous of bird workers when they're able to say, within a few percentage points, the sort of population increase and decrease from year to year, and exactly
Yes.
how many breeding nests are known in an area. When assessing insects, we have to adjust our standards. Yes, we have to adjust our standards and our expectations of what is possible. Um, Even at a European level, where we have access to much more data, it's still very difficult to convincingly assess a species. To answer the question specifically for Lebanon, there will of course be many Andrena that we just don't know enough about because they have only been recorded from one or two specimens. In fact, some have been described from just one or two specimens, and those are the only two specimens in the world. But given the biogeographical nature of Lebanon, with two major mountain chains, and given how specialized Andrena are, we can actually make some more confident assessments. For example, the species I just mentioned, Andrena cedricola, we know that this is only going to be found at high altitude because that's the pattern of this species group. And you don't find species at high altitude and describe them as new for science if they are also present at lower altitudes. So because we know the ecology and we know the distribution and we know it's present in threatened habitat, the cedar forest, we can make some evidence-based assessments. And so, yes, I think we can make evidence-based assessments, not for all species, but certainly for some species.
This is one example that you gave here of threats that wild bees or this Andrena specifically can face, which is being in a high altitude area that is already threatened by climate change, for example. Based on what we know about Andrena, what other threats can they face?
These may not all be applicable to Lebanon, but some species can suffer from either an increase in deforestation or a decrease in deforestation. Where species need open woodland edge habitat, actually too much forest growth can shade them out and be negative, and equally just a loss of that forest would also be negative. So some of them rely on sort of a delicate balance of disturbance, and if that changes, that can disrupt their populations. The species that don't use trees, that fly close to the ground, they can be very negatively affected by overgrazing. That's something I was surprised in Lebanon is I didn't see a lot of grazing, whereas when I go to North Africa, like Morocco, there's a lot of problems with overgrazing. So that was a pleasant surprise to not see that. Many Andrena also like these disturbed habitats like agriculture, or that can be found next to agriculture, using weeds and sort of, plants that grow at the edge of the field. This is more of a problem in Europe, but if too many pesticides and fertilizers are used, then that will reduce the abundance and diversity of flowers, and that will negatively affect bees. Um,
So, in order to preserve a maximum of the diversity that we have locally, one of the measures that can be taken is a bit of a generic measure that would be applicable to all wild bees, which is maintaining the diversity of habitats. So, having dense forests, but also having enough clearings or open habitats, or as you say, low intensity grazing areas where their host plants can still thrive and also giving the weeds a chance to grow in agricultural areas, so that they can still find something to eat, basically.
Yes, it's the wonderful thing about the Mediterranean. It's that diversity of land uses in a small area and that mosaic habitat fragments.
I agree, and I'm not biased. For the closing section of this interview, is there any advice that you would like to give to future entomologists, whether they are interested in entomology as a career or as a hobby?
What I would say is that it's fantastically easy to start and fantastically easy to find things that nobody has ever seen before. Because we have literally millions of insect and invertebrate species, there are more things than we could ever possibly see. And so if you pick a group and you put in some time, you will make real contributions to human knowledge. Not meaning to sound grand, but it's just to say that you can discover things immediately. And I'm biased because I work on insects, but when you work on birds and mammals and reptiles, they are better studied because there are just fewer species and more people. So entomology is exciting if you want to make your mark and to find new things.
Well, I will just add to that a lot of species or insect groups in general stay under the radar because they are small, and there is this barrier of being able to properly look at them. So, rather by doing microphotography or looking at the binoculars. But I would encourage people, as you said, to go into insects and just invertebrates in general, because there will be tools and there will be people who are happy to help you move forward.
Yeah, so I think the message is, yeah, go for it. Um,
Yes,
Even
I
if you don't
agree.
have any experience at all, just go for it.
And to wrap up this interview, are there any closing ideas or anything else that you wanted to expand on or say?
Um, no, I think we covered I think we covered most of it. I guess the takeaway message is that bees are very good at using different habitat types, and when you have countries that are extremely rich in habitat types, perhaps it's an unsurprising conclusion to say that bees love these countries and are very diverse there.